You've touched on this quite a bit, I think, with some of your previous answers, but if there was one key tip that absolutely everyone must follow, what would it be?
I mean, for any organization, it would have to be the passwords. For me, I think it's an area that, I mean, every organization has to do it. It's the easiest entry. And because of that, we're seeing at the moment a lot of living off the land, but we're seeing threat actors, instead of hacking and breaking in, we're seeing them log in. So it's now getting to a point where good password management, and I'm not talking about just a strong password, but all the practices around kind of changing and cycling passwords, making sure that you don't use a previous password, making sure you cycle them in a periodic kind of, or a period, because we're seeing loads of leaked credentials out on the internet. So I think that is something that is extremely key.
Cybersecurity certainly isn't slowing down, and neither are we. Secure CyberConnect are thrilled to be back and be part of the Cyber Leaders Summit this coming 3rd and 4th of November in Manchester. This private, curated forum brings together senior practitioners, decision makers, and thought leaders from across the cyber sector, focused on actionable insights, strategic leadership, and peer-driven conversations. It's about more than trends. We're tackling real challenges, sharing breach case stories, navigating regulation, talking about well-being, and building meaningful relationships that move the industry forward. If you're looking for sharp thinking, practical takeaways, and high-level connections, then register your interest in the link in the bio below.
This is the Secure CyberConnect podcast with Jay Adamson and Warren Atkinson, where we're doing way information cybersecurity, technology, and talent acquisition professionals. We share our journeys, unique perspectives, and offer advice and guidance.
Our topics on this episode will be cyber awareness, mentorship, and cybersecurity consultancy. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Nick Jackson. Nick is a seasoned cybersecurity leader with over 13 years of experience in risk advisory, offensive security, and cyber operations. As the director of a global cybersecurity services team, Nick specializes in advising organizations on how to navigate the evolving threat landscape. With a background spanning both strategic and technical domains, Nick has worked with highly regulated industries to enhance their security postures, improve compliance readiness, and strengthen their cyber defenses. His expertise includes cybersecurity governance, adversarial simulations that bridge the gap between compliance and real-world security. And throughout his career, Nick has held many key roles, the likes of PwC, NCC Group, and Bridewell, advising and supporting customers in a multitude of industries such as financial, infrastructure, oil and gas, luxury retail, foreign governments, and hospitality and leisure. Nick is also a regular speaker at industry events and roundtables where he contributes to discussions on cybersecurity strategy, regulatory challenges including DORA compliance, and the future of offensive security. Nick, welcome to the Secure CyberConnect podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to talking.
Thrilled to have you here, Nick. Could we start by sharing a high-level overview of some of the themes and topics that we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, so I think Jay mentioned some of the stuff we'll talk about will be kind of like cyber hygiene, cyber kind of basics, what would we perceive as the fundamentals for security for businesses and organizations. We're also going to cover things around mentorship, kind of career advice, guidance. So some of the stuff I've done in my career for myself and how I've been guided through my own career, then kind of what I've given back myself. And then also I think there's some challenging stuff at the end that you guys have prepared for me. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into the depth of that.
No, really looking forward to unpacking that all. And could you share with the audience something that you're perhaps proud of, excited about, or want to shine a light upon that isn't featured on your LinkedIn?
Yeah, it'd probably be the mentorship piece. As I said kind of briefly before, I firmly believe I'm only where I am because of the kind of guidance and mentorship that I got throughout my career. Big shout out, for example, specifically to the likes of Paul Midian, who I started my career at with PwC, who's now at EasyJet, and a couple of other partners as examples at PwC that again, did the standard thing of berating my initial reports to kind of show me the light and show me the direction. And then, still to this day, if I was to, consider moving company, I would still kind of ring some of them up and ask their advice and guidance. But because of that, I have then gone on to do some, mentorship for students. I do at least one individual a year through this program I work with. And one of them more recently has just got his second promotion at NCC Group. So I started working with him back in 2016, 2017, maybe, did like a work experience, a couple of weeks with me. And after then basically finishing school, he went straight to work for NCC Group after I kind of put him in connection with them on a kind of next gen program. And he's absolutely flying, smashing it. And it's a really proud achievement for me. I think I may have posted one thing on LinkedIn, but it's not kind of overtly there. But a number of other people, I know somebody who's applied for GCHQ, somebody who's working with, I think it was Deloitte or KPMG and their M&A due diligence cyber team. It's really nice to see that I'm able to help back. And, it doesn't take a lot from my side, but it really gives me a lot of, pride.
No, that's incredibly inspiring. Appreciate you sharing that. And you've demonstrated the power that it's had from a personal perspective, as well as obviously you helping others through the door. And, it's something that myself and Jay really champion. So we do commend you for your contributions in that respect. And Nick, could you share with us something in relation to a challenge that you faced in your career that's shaped your views and perspective on cyber?
Challenges I've faced. So, there's obviously a number of client challenges where whether it's the bureaucracy or kind of organizational complexities where you have to navigate, hierarchy. For example, you're trying to put a finding in a report and the client's not happy with it, or the fact that you're doing a review and for some people it's considered an audit and you're kind of, working with them, and sometimes they feel like you're working against them to kind of mark their homework, whereas in reality you're trying to show them the next steps and the way forward to try and maybe get them more budget or financial support in that sense, or get the board on their side. And sometimes you don't necessarily get that backing from the individuals you're working with because they see you as an auditor, kind of, like I said, marking the homework. So I think there's that challenge. And then there's probably wider challenges of working in consulting, whereby, sometimes more senior individuals in the organization don't have the experience that you were hoping for, or aren't able to give you, like I said before, the guidance that you were hoping, which I think from a career development perspective is a challenge that I would argue quite a lot of people face, because it's an industry where there's probably quite a few older individuals in a different generation to myself who are more senior in organizations that maybe in the past didn't have maybe that pastoral care that I think the younger generation now do. And the younger generation expect. I think it was a bit more tough love back then, and I don't think that works. It didn't work with me. I didn't like it when I was at some of the organizations I've worked at in the past, and I don't think it worked. So I think that's a challenge that a lot of people probably face in the industry.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And, lessons learned, successes, of course, it's one of the main reasons we started the podcast. So could you briefly share with us perhaps a mistake that you've made in your career and what lessons you learned along the way?
A challenge I faced, I think one of that will probably be kind of internal politics. So to the point I made before, it's kind of how to navigate that effectively, whether it's, clashes with line managers, clashes with, other senior stakeholders. It's finding the right people to talk to get the most effective outcome. And it goes the same, as I mentioned before, briefly with clients. If you're maybe talking to the wrong stakeholder, you've got the wrong person, you haven't got the right point of contact to kind of back you, it can cause serious problems from either career development perspective internally, or from landing the report in the right way, making sure that the messaging comes through clearly. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge I could probably share. There's probably other stuff, but I don't think I can share it.
So, look, getting into one of the main topics we want to talk about today in terms of sort of security, hygiene, awareness, really stripping it back to the basics. We've had a number of previous guests on the podcast talking about cybersecurity awareness, but for many of our audience who may be small business owners or aren't quite as experienced within cyber and how to best protect their businesses, let's strip it back to some of the absolute basics. So what are some of the key cybersecurity policies that every single business should have in place first and foremost? And how can some of these smaller businesses look at protecting themselves from cyber attacks on what would ultimately be a much more limited budget?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that people can do, or organizations can do, especially on the smaller side, whether it's finding, the likes of a cheaper priced EDR, XDR, MDR service, whereby there's a kind of agent on a device that is essentially monitoring what's happening and making sure that it can detect and respond, or hopefully prevent and protect it earlier on. So that's like a technical control that's something that I think most organizations should look to invest in, and they're not that expensive. You're not looking at hundreds and thousands of pounds. You're looking at potentially £5, £2 a month, depending on what you're looking at. And I think a lot of small organizations should look at that. I think some of the complexities behind that is organizations don't necessarily know what to ask. As an example, my uncle's an accountant, has a small accountancy practice, has an IT kind of managed service provider that works for them, and they do some security stuff. Does he know the right questions to ask? Does he know what EDR, XDR technology they may be using? He has absolutely no idea. I've asked him. I've asked him for the specific order so I can see what he's actually using and see if I can advise the MSP to do something differently. So I think there's that. I think there's also the kind of basic stuff you mentioned before, security awareness, making sure that everyone understands the full risk to the business, even if we're not talking about kind of annual e-learning or annual security training of some description. Even if you don't do that, I think having just an upfront conversation with your staff, say you're a team of 10 people, have a conversation, understand how security could impact their personal life, understand how security could impact the company and therefore their job security, because the company could go under, for example, and making that message really stick with them, I think is important. Because again, when I spoke to my uncle, he obviously is my uncle, so I see him quite a lot. He doesn't understand the full impact of security. He's got an accountancy practice, tax advisory, has some good clients, but he doesn't understand the full impact to him. He says to me things like, "Oh, there's stuff in the cloud. Okay, how's the cloud protected? Is it misconfigured? Blah, blah, blah." So there's loads of things that people can think of. But I think the biggest thing for small organizations is going back to basic stuff, the real cyber hygiene that I think you referred to at the beginning, which is anything from passwords. Try and utilize MFA where it's possible. If you're using passwords, try and use passphrases, which is just a more complex password in reality. But try and use a password manager where you have a super, super, super secure one password that you remember that basically protects the password manager, and then just use the password manager for everything else. You don't need to remember any password. Ideally, you don't remember any password, because then it's hard for anyone to guess because it's got no relevance to you. And I think that's probably the basic core fundamentals. The only other thing, aside from the kind of EDR, XDR technologies, the password management, the security awareness, I would argue is a kind of some sort of cybersecurity insurance. I think a lot of organizations that potentially aren't prepared, haven't done security awareness, may not have the right password management policies or practices in place. An event is potentially more likely to happen than you think. And therefore, if you have cyber insurance, it'll give you some protection. There'll be some form of kind of forensics or incident response panel that you can put on if an incident was to happen. So you'll get some financial support at the back end if an incident was to happen, which, for example, if you needed to put on forensic support tomorrow, you probably wouldn't know who to reach out to. So the insurance can really help, whether it's from the financial or the actual vendors that are on a panel that can support. So they're the kind of few key takeaways that I would provide.
Just on a more granular level, what do you think the best advice is and the most security conscious way of disposing of old devices, for example, or of course, most importantly, data?
Yeah. So there's a few different options. I mean, if you're going down the kind of technical stances of some of the standards that are in the industry, you're looking at things like degaussing, which essentially is a very big magnet, which works on some of the old kind of hard drives where it will essentially magnetize it and destroy it. There's also things like crypto shredding, where you can essentially encrypt data. I think it encrypts it more than once, if I'm not wrong. And the idea is that it then disposes of the keys, so no one essentially can crack it. There's obviously the risk there with quantum computing. Again, you're encrypting and encrypting and encrypting and encrypting, because I think it does it multiple times. So it's extremely difficult. But with quantum computing, in theory, in the future, it may be more possible. The easiest way is to essentially remove it, essentially delete it and degauss it and do a bit of everything and do actual physical shredding if you're wanting to get to the full crux of it. We did a piece of work recently with an organization in the UK that essentially part of their business is installing new kit, new hardware, and removing the old stuff and essentially disposing of it for organizations. They also take old stuff from the likes of Amazon to restore it. They also kind of take products in and donate them to schools. So there's a lot of things there in the sense of taking data. What do we do with it? Do we remove it, delete it? How do we get rid of it? Do we put in a new hard drive? And they have a whole, and we did the assessment with them, a whole area where they first degauss, they drill a hole through the hard drive itself, and then they shred the device from end to end. So it goes into, there's different standards and I can't remember them, but depending on the millimeter of thickness of the shredding. So if you want to go full end to end, that's the best route of course. Otherwise, yeah, it would probably be encrypting, deleting, and storing it somehow. But I think for smaller businesses, it is a more complex conversation, but potentially the easiest option because of that is ideally if you're using something like Office 365 and something like that, try not to store anything on the device itself. Try to store everything into things like SharePoint, because then you don't have to worry about the physical element. It's only the digital element, which you can then delete and essentially crypto shred by encrypting and encrypting, which means it's less onerous for you. So I would advise that to any smaller business.
Okay, I appreciate that. And just, you've touched on this quite a bit, I think, with some of your previous answers, but if there was one key tip that absolutely everyone must follow, what would it be?
I mean, for any organization, it would have to be the passwords. For me, I think it's an area that, every organization has to do it. It's the easiest entry. We're seeing, again, Bitdefender's got a lot of threat intelligence. 38% of the world's telemetry comes through our system, so we have a bit of a unique perspective. And because of that, we're seeing at the moment a lot of living off the land, but we're seeing threat actors, instead of hacking and breaking in, we're seeing them log in. So it's now getting to a point where good password management, and I'm not talking about just a strong password, but all the practices around kind of changing and cycling passwords, making sure that you don't use a previous password, making sure you cycle them in a periodic or a period. Because we're seeing loads of leaked credentials out on the internet when we're doing our offensive capability services. For example, if we're doing a black box test and we don't get given any credentials from the customer, we go on the dark web and we look for them. And if we find leaked credentials, we then log in and we tell the customer, although it's a black box and we focused before the authentication kind of perspective of that application or whatever it was, we were still able to get in because we found leaked credentials. So I think that is something that is extremely key. It's becoming more common, as I said, as an attack vector. So I think organizations need to focus more on that.
Are there any open source or free resource out there where organizations can perhaps sort of check to see if any of their login details have been compromised?
Yeah, there is. There's sites like I think it's called I have been pawned or something like that. It's PWNED, I think. You can search for that on Google, and it is a very good resource. Unfortunately, obviously, it's not complete. Again, we know we're on a number of different Discord channels and Telegram channels, and again, just searching the dark web, and there's a lot of things on there that are not on those websites, but it's definitely a good point. And again, if there's been a number of kind of high profile breaches, it will list the ones that are there, and there's probably going to be a number of different sources that you don't even realize you're part of because you signed up years ago. So yeah, definitely worth checking.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And my advice to any small organization, if you do see yourself on these sites, reach out to Nick and the team where they can really take a deeper dive for you.
And looking at more senior securities, for those who are in more established environments, and obviously business and security leaders that may be watching or listening to this episode, what advice would you give to them, those that are seeking to mature their policies and procedures, create and foster a long-term, cyber awareness culture?
It's a good question. I think there's a number of different things to play. For me, understanding what the business is, understanding the general culture of the business is an important first step. I don't think security culture and awareness is something that can be improved as a blanket one-stop shop across all different companies. As an example, I've done work for an oil and gas company in the past. They have a very heavy focus on health and safety. Every webinar, every event that they do always has a health and safety moment at the start of it. That's a very ingrained piece of their culture. And by being able to leverage that, for example, you're able to then improve the security culture because you can kind of dovetail from what is already in place. For smaller organizations that may be in the kind of retail sector, they don't have a heavy focus on health and safety. So you have to have a different approach, a different methodology. But I think making the content, one, relevant, two, super engaging. So let's move away from these standardized, e-learning platforms that you buy and is the same for every organization because they're not specific in any way, and try and find platforms that are either, like I said, more engaging, include some things like gamification, so it kind of excites the user, engages the user more when they're actually engaging with it, making it more personal to them as an individual. So again, understanding how this impacts the business, but that means it can impact their job security and their job, but also from a personal perspective. What does this mean, and showing the impact to them personally? Because I think good cyber culture and good cyber awareness starts at home. I think a lot of people, forget that side of things, and I think it's an important step. But all of that, the gamification and the wider kind of theater behind security awareness, I think is super important. So creating a theme behind the program, creating more than just Cyber Awareness Week and a Cyber e-learn, doing more things like posters and placemats and screensavers, and really getting in the user's face is really important. Some of the things I've done in the past, as an example, instead of just mandating in a security policy that someone wears a badge, which you typically get at some of the larger organizations, again, that I've worked for in the past specifically, so that when you're walking around the business, they know who you are and they know that you're meant to be there. Again, not everyone stares at the picture to make sure it's you or the name, because pictures are now coming off of those cards, and sometimes names. But I think what we've done with organizations before is, instead of just having someone come into the building and scan the card before they enter the building, we've actually rolled out a red carpet. We've hired, bouncers and got them to stand there to emphasize the importance of this, to show that it is like a club. There's a guest list. You're not supposed to get in if you don't have the card. And if you don't have the card, there's a problem. Because I think before, if you go to some of these organizations, you don't have your card. You go to the front desk and you say, oh, I don't have my card. Can I get a temporary one? So you're losing the gravitas and the importance of that card. So you need to find different ways to stress these things, to bring it up in the minds and the attention of the people. Because a good security awareness program doesn't necessarily improve the culture, but some other things like that gamification and the emphasis is what can potentially improve the culture. Because the culture is more than just, in my opinion, the way I differentiate between the two is more than just the kind of e-learn or the potentially even these things like podcasts, which are great and a lot of organizations do to increase awareness. The culture needs to be more ingrained. It needs to be in everything that an organization does, a bit like I mentioned before with the health and safety moment.
That absolutely needs to be entrenched 100%. And what best approach would you give? I mean, look, first of all, I suppose, when do you think the penny will drop and cyber will actually become front and center for the boardroom? And what is the best approach that you would give to get commitment and buy-in from the board on what is undoubtedly going to be a high number of future cyber projects and programs?
So I think there's a few things. I think, one, I believe that security is becoming, and is every single year becoming, more important. People are starting to see the importance of it. And what I mean by that is I think the enterprises are very much there. Some of them may have slightly different thresholds and appeal for it, but I think more of them than not are cyber conscious. I think more of the smaller organizations are becoming kind of cyber conscious, and it's going further down every year. So more of the small to medium businesses are becoming more cyber aware, cyber conscious, asking the right questions. I think this will become even more so because of some of the things we're seeing again in the industry, again, because of the threat intelligence that we've seen. We've seen a lot of organizations having a lot of organizations are being hit when they're not necessarily being targeted. And what I mean by that is we're seeing threat actors now, instead of targeting specific organizations, they're targeting known vulnerabilities. So there'll be, for example, a known vulnerability will come out, and within, it used to be back in 2023, I think Verizon released a report and said it was roughly 5 days between the known vulnerability being essentially published and then them being exploited. We're now seeing this within about 24 hours. The minute it's known to essentially threat actors, organizations are being compromised within 24 hours. They don't necessarily do anything within maybe 30 days because they have probably compromised 1,000 to 10,000 organizations, because they typically go for the known vulnerabilities that have a big widespread impact in terms of a number of devices, typically in the thousands to tens of thousands of devices. So you don't necessarily see an impact straight away, but we've seen evidence in devices and log files to show that devices and organizations have been compromised within 24 hours. So because of that, I think the small to medium businesses will probably start to get hit more quickly than in the past, and we'll start to see a bigger uptick and an exponential increase in awareness, understanding, and board concern for cybersecurity at the smaller levels. But like I said, I think the bigger levels are starting to get there. I think alongside that, which I think is important to note, is cyber risk quantification is something that has been a topic of conversation since I've been in the industry. And I still think I don't want to say we haven't got there yet. I'm exploring a organization now that offers a CRQ tool, but I haven't got into the weeds of it yet, so I don't know how good it is. But it's always been a very complex situation. And at the end of the day, cyber is another risk. And boards talk in financial terms. They'll obviously understand and want to understand brand reputational damage and things like that, but the main concern of them will be financial. So I think the CRQ technologies that are coming out that will allow us to demonstrate whether it's return on investment, whether it's the risk itself on a financial perspective. I think the CRQs will also help maybe even enterprise level boards that are, you're struggling to get their hearts and minds in the right place. That technology and those tools will really help that. So I'm hoping the technology is massively improved and hopefully we'll see that uptick.
Appreciate you sharing. And on your point on CVEs and CVSs, for instance, I know the program was under threat in terms of the funding most recently. So from your perspective, how important are the CVE programs and the Europeans' new version of that?
I think they are important. I think the thing to note is, though, that they're reactive. You're looking at essentially people. It's a very old, I say old, it's going to become, in my opinion, in the future, a dated way of managing security. It's still needed. So I think it's, still important. And I understand that I think people will club together to make sure that it isn't impacted in any way. But it is a very dated methodology in a sense of you're looking for an old pattern or an old signature, and you're essentially then, when you identify it, you're then closing it and et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I think there needs to be a more proactive, preventative methodology assigned, and I think everyone calls it like the shift left, to kind of be more proactive. And if we can achieve that with, and I think we'll discuss it later, for example, the Bitdefender phaser technology by reducing the attack surface and things like that, I think that is a better way for organizations to move. But there's no qualms about it. Things like the CVEs are databases and information that every organization is always going to need and will always benefit organizations that maybe can't afford some of the technology that is more proactive and don't have the necessary resources to kind of move in that direction.
No, I appreciate you sharing your perspective. And of course, at the top of the session, you mentioned something that you're proud of, mentorship, for instance. So why is mentorship vital for the cybersecurity industry, and how does someone go about finding a good mentor?
Again, good question. I think in the industry, the easiest way, if you're in it already, is to find someone who you trust in the organization you work with or that you've met along your way. Whether you're, part of ISACA, again, they have things like mentorship programs that you can get involved with, or you just go to one of their events. For example, again, I'm part of the London chapter. You can go to their event and meet people. There's other events you can go to meet people and network. I think taking someone like that where they're not in your business also has some advantages. So maybe a balance of the two if you can. But I think it's just about talking to people. I am part of a program called Aut UK, which do also have the mentorship program. That's more for school leavers who are looking to get into the industry. So it's a bit different than maybe mentorship within the industry, which is why I would stress finding someone in your organization that can help. So as I said before, I specifically focused on, there was one partner specifically, and then Paul Midian that I mentioned. As I said, every single career move I've ever made, I've always messaged him and asked his opinion. Value his understanding, his input a lot. He's obviously been in the industry a long time and has a perspective from a consulting side as well as in-house, which I think is a unique perspective that not many have. But yeah, I think that's the best way.
And do you think individuals perhaps should look outside the cybersecurity remit for mentorship?
It depends what you want to get out of it. If you're looking to gain understanding of and ask questions of, for example, if I'm in the cybersecurity space, should I go to consultancy to in-house? I think someone maybe outside of the industry could advise you on that because, as an example, if you're an in-house CFO versus an associate consultant or partner at a big four, for example, in the accounting team, you have that perspective and maybe you can talk around it. If your understanding or your question and your uncertainty, which you're looking for guidance of, is should I go down an offensive route? Should I go down, as in a more technical point, in a technical pathway in the sector, or a more GRC consulting focus, then I think you need to find someone who's been in the industry and understands it a bit better. So for example, when I'm talking to my colleagues, even my team, I always say the advice and guidance I give you is not because it benefits Bitdefender or where we are now currently, or regardless of where I'm working. It's to benefit your career long-term because you're not going to be here. Some of these people that I work with are, between 24 and 30. They're not going to finish their career at Bitdefender, more than likely, and wherever I work. So I'm always saying, if you do this certification, yes, it's industry well known and worldwide. It's industry and globally recognized. However, it's not necessarily something that's different and will make you stand out. So I'm always saying, for example, OT is a new space, or not a new space, but it's a space where I feel like the skill set is diminishing. And if you were to do IEC 62243 as an example, you're going to stand out from the crowd and there's going to be some unique opportunities for you. So it's understanding which place to go into. And I think depending on what guidance you want, I don't think it's necessarily the best option to go outside the industry, but there is definitely value in some ways.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've obviously touched on the reasons for your inspiration becoming a mentor, as well as obviously some of the topics and areas that you find rewarding personally. But could you perhaps share with the audience 3 pros and 3 cons of being a mentor?
3 pros are the kind of internal satisfaction. It's very, very satisfying to help them, but then to physically see them succeed by getting jobs and really progressing through their careers. It's actually quite exciting. I get a text every so often from someone saying, I'm here, I'm doing this, I got a promotion, I got a pay rise, and I'm like, cool, I like that. Another pro, I think it helps you as you become more senior. It's almost like a touch in the water for line management. If you've never been a manager before, you don't have that skill. Maybe you don't have you're not comfortable doing it. You don't have that natural aptitude that some people do have. I think it gives you that innate experience to start asking the right questions, challenging someone, maybe sometimes having difficult conversations. I don't think you're ready for this, or I think that's a step too far, whatever it may be. So I think that's also a really good pro from it. I think another pro, which isn't necessarily a personal pro, but I think for the industry, there's a knowing confusion in terms of which sector, which area to go into. And I think by providing clarity, you're helping the industry. Also, hopefully you're adding to the skill set by providing advice and guidance to someone to hopefully improve the skill shortage that we're all, very much keen about talking about all the time. I say cons. I can't say there's many cons. I mean, there's only one con I can think of, and it's when someone was paired with me and they probably they were probably advised to go on the program and they weren't really bothered about the program. So their heart and mind wasn't in it. And it just meant that, they didn't turn up to some of the sessions, even the first one. Again, I don't know the full reason behind it, so maybe there was another factor behind it, but it sometimes can feel like a waste of time in that sense. But again, I've been doing this for a number of years and I've only had that once, so there's not a big con if I'm honest. So I would massively advise people to get involved. It is massively rewarding for yourself and for the individual and the industry as a whole.
I appreciate sharing perspective. And Nick, what would you class as a good mentor? And it begs the question, of course, and I know you've evidenced it in this interview today, but what makes you a good mentor?
What makes a good mentor? I think someone who listens is obviously super important. These people, especially I'm going to say kids, they're like, 17, 18. The people that I'm talking to some of them are very clever, very clever. Some of them are individuals that to some degree know more than me in some area. As we all know, some of the younger generation are coming through and are, they've lived and breathed AI and LLMs for more than we have because they haven't been working when it's been coming out. So they've been playing around with it for years. So I think some of the understanding, some of their knowledge is very unique. But yeah, I think it's someone who's good at listening, someone who is keen to, go above and beyond and do research. So for example, someone asked me, should I go to university, or for example, I don't know if I mentioned it before, there's a course at GCHQ where you can do like a work experience with them whilst you're doing your degree, and they fund your degree and things like that. I had no idea about that course before this individual asked me the question. So I went out and did my own research, understood kind of what was on offer, how it worked, what the pros were, what the cons were. And I think if someone's not willing to go above and beyond and isn't just there to do the kind of maybe 1 hour a week or 1 hour every other week, whatever it may be, to have a conversation, you're not going to get as much out of it, because if they don't know, which in our industry, it's impossible to know everything. Some people get very close. Some people I've worked with in the past, a CEO at my last company, I would say, knew most things. You need to do that extra research. You need someone whose heart and mind is in it as much as the individual. What else would I say is in it? I would say a good mentor is also someone who's got a good network. Again, I'm not taking all the credit by any means, but the individual I mentioned before, who I said is doing extremely well at the moment at NCC Group, I only managed to get him the job because of the network I had. So, I reached out to, at the time, the old CTO, big shout out to Ollie Whitehouse, now at the NCSC. I basically sent him a message, said, "Hi, Ollie, obviously we haven't seen each other in a while. I've got somebody who's really keen to, do a kind of grad scheme. I know that NCC have something in place. Can you try and hook me up? I think we've passed the deadline." And long story short, he managed to get the guy or the person an interview. And the person's now, like I said, absolutely smashing it. So I think the network is super, super important. I'm not saying I'm the best mentor by any means. There's definitely people that are better than me, but I'm pretty confident I have those three kind of like facets to my to myself. I've got a relatively good network. I've been in the industry quite a long time. Definitely not the longest. There's plenty of people that have been here longer, but I talk quite a lot, as you might have told, as you might be able to tell. But yeah, I'm always keen to listen. Like I said, there's definitely areas I don't know, so I'm always keen to learn myself, because hopefully I can then give the guidance to someone else in the future. So those three things are very important, I think, to make a good mentor.
I appreciate you sharing, Nick.
And let's talk a little bit about what the future looks like within the cyber sector. Yeah, it's clear the future of cyber is going to be a pretty fast-moving, pretty crazy time, with technologies such as quantum and zero trust architecture, and the geopolitical landscape throwing up insane levels of unforeseen events on what appears to be a near weekly basis. And then we've got AI-powered offensive and defensive security. And my own personal fears, and I know Warren and I have spoken about this a lot, being more centered around sort of everyday connected devices and the threats they're going to start posing more and more. How do you approach the balance between all these advancing technological capabilities and still maintaining, these strong cybersecurity measures?
It's a good question, and I think it's something that organizations, I don't believe, have really all got. And what I mean by that is things like AI and quantum will become the topic of conversation because maybe the boards have heard of it and their attention massively diverts. I was at a conference last week, the Cyber Leaders Summit, and a lady, I can't remember her name, stood up and basically said the same thing. She stood up and said, we're talking about AI, and every conference I've been to, we're talking about AI. We're talking about the same thing in reality. We've not got anywhere because everyone's still kind of navigating it to some degree. If we all had our basic cyber hygiene down and had it correct, and had the fundamentals or foundations, whatever you want to call it, secure, and that's where our focus was, the threats of all this stuff, which in reality, quantum, we're still quite far away. Yes, we should start looking at crypto safe, crypto secure kind of standards and things like that, or quantum safe crypto standards. In reality, that's not here now. And even with things like AI, if you have basic processes in place and you have the fundamentals there, most things won't affect you. So for example, AI, the biggest thing we're seeing at the moment is deepfakes. If someone's trying to authorize a big payment, for example, and they're using a deepfake to do that, if you had a good process in place where there's maybe, some sort of approval where you have to get a second factor of approval or second person approval or something as basic as that, which isn't technical, you won't make that payment. So some of these really technical things that are coming out that are causing more complexities and definitely making organizations think twice, to some degree, I feel are pulling the wool over our eye, making us focus in the wrong place, and the fundamentals would stop that. Somebody again at the conference the other week said something as basic as, we don't need to create an AI policy because our acceptable use policy talks about the fact that we shouldn't be putting public information on the web and blah, 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 blah. So when we use things like ChatGPT, our users should know, if they've read that and we're informing them every year or on a more periodic basis, reminding them of what is in that document, that they shouldn't be using things like ChatGPT because it already covers it. But organizations are, again, trying to jump on the bandwagon. They're releasing AI policies and different things like that to, tackle the trend. But at the end of the day, some of the fundamentals in cyber hygiene that we should all be doing, that if we focused our attention on that, would, to some degree, not completely, but to some degree would help us in that vein. Not to say that the kind of AI offensive and AI defensive technologies and threats out there would all be covered by it, and we still need to be looking into it. Again, that's why Bitdefender, develop our products which use AI to tackle that. And, internally we've created our own AIs, both offensive and defensive, to improve and train our teams and our technology. So we see the benefits of it, but it's not to take away from the fundamentals that I think organizations should really focus on personally.
Yeah, no, we say it time and time again on the podcast. It's basics. A lot of things are a distraction, shiny new toys, shiny new threats, but basics. So for companies who are looking to, I guess, scale up and, when the markets do start to recover more and more, how can many of these leaders within these organizations strike that vital balance between fostering the innovation and ensuring that security first is still there as the organization scales up?
So I think it's the easiest way, and what I would recommend is doing a light touch or in detail, depending on the budget and the time that you've got, a kind of maturity assessment or a risk assessment to understand, what is the risk to my business? Where are we worried? Where are we concerned the most? What will impact our business? where are our controls mature, where do they have deficiencies where we need to improve them, and creating a proper cybersecurity roadmap that says, how can we tackle this problem? How can we get the biggest bang for our buck? How can we, close the gaps as quickly as possible that are posing our business the biggest risk? Yes, AI needs to be, or the consideration for AI and quantum need to be on that roadmap because it is an eventual risk, but it's not something that's going to maybe impact our business today, or isn't the biggest gap that we have on our control, in comparison to a industry framework you may follow, ISO, NIST, CSF, whatever it may be. There may be other controls that you're deficient in that you need to focus your attention on more so because of the biggest risk that you're ignoring. Again, people at organizations will say AI is here, let's worry about that risk, but there could be a very basic insider risk that we're not thinking about, that there's a basic control we could implement that we haven't yet that can be done. So I think organizations need to think about that, and really what we see, again, after talking to customers, is people need to really use threat intelligence better. Some people don't get any threat intelligence feeds. Some people get threat intelligence feeds, but don't consume them in the correct way for the business, i.e. understanding what it really means for us. But understanding what we can really gain from it is important to inform that risk assessment properly, to take a proper threat-driven approach to what needs to be done, and to define that roadmap properly. I think would be my best suggestion for organizations. And again, that's for large and for small.
And with so many startups emerging, and there's a very high number, how do you separate what is genuine innovation from a lot of this empty marketing hype when we're going to be choosing tools and solutions for the future?
Good question. So again, not to talk about Bitdefender too much, because I know that's not the main point of the podcast, but we've been using AI since 2008. We get very frustrated when we go to different conferences and a vendor next to us that does a very similar thing has posted first organization to use AI, and they've never mentioned it before, and we know they definitely weren't the first organization to use AI, because we probably were, if not 100% were, in our space specifically. So I think for me, how does an organization, understand that? There's obviously the third party kind of risk management due diligence the organization should do to understand more so what the product is or what the organization is that we're working with, especially a vendor. But if it's specifically a vendor that's providing your product, do serious due diligence on the product, not only the organization, and then have proof of concept to understand what is actually being done. There are a lot of organizations that will claim they're being innovative, and they probably are, especially some of the younger ones, because they're more agile, and definitely don't, completely forget them from your consideration. If I look at some of the larger, systems like ServiceNow, OneTrust, they're very good, they're very expensive, but there are a lot of other smaller organizations like Anecdote, for example, that can offer similar capabilities, sometimes better capabilities for cheaper money, and are much more innovative because they move quicker and they're much faster paced. So I think having the proof of concept, understanding what it is you want to achieve, and understanding which product is actually going to fit that, rather than just listening to who's got the biggest marketing budget, is definitely the biggest thing. But yeah, demo is proof of concepts, definitely recommend, and you can do it with 3-4 vendors. I know it takes up time, but like you said, it's best to do that rather than focus on the marketing hype, because marketing people are very, very good.
Choose wisely, without a doubt.
So yeah, Nick, as we address some of the tough issues, offensive security techniques such as pen testing, for instance, are very common. But myself and Jay have been involved in conversations, and we've heard arguments from organisations that are considering hacking back. But we understand that obviously blurs ethical lines. So do you believe organisations should have the right to hack back when under attack? Or does this introduce dangerous ethical and legal implications that potentially escalate the situation?
Another good question. I would say that organizations, firstly, again, I'll get to your question after, firstly should focus on themselves. I think if an incident is to arise, I think the worst thing to do first is to hack back. If that is a consideration an organization wants to make, fine, but that should never, ever, ever be the primary focus. Focusing on yourself, containing the incident, performing forensics, informing the relevant stakeholders, maybe, the ICO, if there's data in there and it's a UK organization or whatever may be relevant. I think that needs to be the focal point first, getting the systems back up and running, get operations going back to normal from a BCP, disaster recovery perspective. That should be point one. In general, should organizations after the fact look at hacking back? There is probably major, which I don't even understand because I'm not a lawyer by any means, but major legal and definitely ethical quandaries to come about. My perspective, and obviously I definitely wouldn't advise this, but I would like to think potentially in the future, again, this is the first time I've ever really thought about it, but I would like to think a debate can come up in the future where there could be something that happens, or organizations are allowed to do something just to be able to protect them, or to be able to also, if they've got the relevant capabilities, to be able to provide law enforcement and other agencies information by doing it. So I'm not saying doing it just to, hack in and cause them more problems, because you're only going to get retaliatory come back from the threat actor. Essentially, these are sometimes big organizations, massive buildings of employees that are employed to do this. So you're not looking at one individual. So if you hit them, they will find a way to hit back and hit you hard, and they will put a lot of effort. Motivation will be super, super high. So there's a massive detrimental impact potentially in the future. But if there's something that you can do light touch that would provide some information, whether it's just potentially where they're based, or some more information about them to try and understand which threat actor it might be, or if someone can hack back to try and covertly try and find encryption keys, or find out what algorithm they may be using, or whatever it may be, if ransomware was to be a factor. I don't understand the legal impacts, but I think it would be something that the industry could explore. Again, if potentially we're seeing again at Bitdefender more of a switch from ransomware where data is encrypted, more as a focal point now is the exfiltration of the data, and the encryption and the ransomware piece is more of an afterthought and a secondary goal. So if a threat actor was to have exfiltrated data, should an organization be allowed to, if legally, lawfully allowed, should they be able to hack into potentially the threat actor systems, which you'd imagine are super secure, but would they be able to hack in and then remove said data that was exfiltrated to minimize the impact to them? Again, there's going to be loads of arguments that the data is not in a specific computer, that someone has stored and have stored somewhere in the cloud that you're going to have to find. But I think there's an interesting conversation there that could definitely happen in the future. Do I think it will ever be legal? Probably not. It will probably be massively advised against, a bit like probably from a physical, incident that was to happen. Should you ever fight back a terrorist? Probably not. Run for the hills. But I think it's something that potentially will be explored in the future as the industry matures a bit more.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And on cyber insurance and ransomware, for instance, do you think organizations should pay ransoms, or do you think there's a point that they shouldn't, for instance?
Again, it's a bit like, these dodgy sticks that people have to watch the sports. It's a bit like the DVDs you used to get with, pirated movies. By paying anything like that, you are essentially funding these groups, these organizations, to allow them to keep going. So there's an argument against it, which I would definitely stand behind. But I think the factor that I want to bring up, and again, this was brought to my attention again only a couple of weeks ago by a colleague or an acquaintance called John Staniforth, who used to be the CISO at Royal Mail. And he said to me that there are some situations where you don't have a choice. If you've got cyber insurance and the ransom is less than the potential impact to the business that the insurance provider will have to pay, the cyber insurer will force you to pay. Sometimes they will either pay it directly themselves, or they will say to you, you pay it, because we're not going to pay you if you don't pay it. Say there's an impact to your organization and you haven't paid it, we won't pay that, but we will pay you back the money for the ransom. So sometimes it's not a choice of yours. So, we advise customers to get a ransomware policy, in place to make sure that they know what they need to do and have a process in place to understand how they would react and respond, who's authorized to make the payment. But organizations need to consider that sometimes it's not in their purview to make that decision. The insurance provider themselves will step in and say, you are paying that. So it's definitely a moral quandary, but like I said, sometimes it's out of our hands.
Many claim that there's a cybersecurity talent shortage, but most believe this is misinterpretation, driven by overemphasis on certifications and degrees over practical and hands-on experience. So, Nick, is there a talent shortage? Is it a real problem? Or is it, as most companies, overvaluing formal qualifications over practical experience?
I think it's a number of those, if I'm honest. Again, we spoke about this only a few weeks ago at the conference with a few colleagues. I think there's definitely a shortage in the industry. I think there definitely is. I think where, there's no, don't get me wrong, there is starting to be kind of computer science or, security courses at schools, but it's still very fundamental, if anything, and it's probably more so at some of the private schools. So not everyone is getting it. I think it needs to become a staple at schools from an earlier age to understand the risks, more from a personal life perspective for children as they grow up. But again, that will lead them through their career. And if they go into the industry, some of them may be excited to join the industry because of that, but it'll teach them cybersecurity, but also improve culture in all organizations, as we discussed before. I think certifications themselves are, I don't know if it's the right word, but like antiquated. They're seriously outdated. We're looking at theory most of the time rather than practical stuff. The CISSP, which most organizations ask for and most people in the industry look to get, it doesn't have anything really practical that most people would actually use. You're talking about, in some way, especially when I did it, which wasn't that long ago, you're looking at, crypto standards and algorithms that are massively outdated and would never be used these days. So we're teaching people the wrong things. In my opinion, we need to have more practical certifications that really support the industry better and teach us things that are more useful. There are courses now, like the Microsoft courses, that are tailored towards Azure, don't get me wrong, but they're more practical, and I think they benefit the organization more so, but are not always on job requirements that organizations put out. So I think there's a disparity between some of the useful certifications, some of the ones that are industry wide and recognized. So I think there's a disparity there. But then to your point, I think some job descriptions have way too much in them. As I said before, the industry is huge. The industry is massive. No one can know everything. There are some unicorns, like I said before, that do know a lot, but they still don't know everything. These people that know a lot probably can't do the manual hacking. They can't do the exploitation on the technical front, that can have the same conversation as the person who's the strategic person that can develop a strategy, a roadmap, and win the hearts and minds of a board. It's very different conversation, very different type of individual from a personality, a characteristic, and a skill set perspective. So when you have somebody or a job description that comes out that talks about a CISO that has to do everything, you're like, that it's impossible. And you need to have, as an organization, flexibility in that. So there needs to be clearly defined in the job description that we not necessarily need someone who does everything, but we want to look for someone that can help fit into this. Because some people would be turned off from applying because they don't fit everything in that job description, which I think is a negative. Similarly, if somebody applies and the organization doesn't understand that no one will have every single one of those capability skill sets, they're going to exclude people straight away. So there's a catch-22 on both sides of that, which I just don't think people are thinking of. But I'm hoping as more children are coming through, and if they do change the curriculum, which is a massive piece of what I'm hoping for, then the whole industry will change in terms of wider culture outside of the security profession, but also people coming into the profession. But yeah, in my opinion, certifications need to change, courses need to change, because they're not useful really at the moment. And as children are becoming more, I'm going to say, digital literate, in a sense of they use digital technology, I would argue they're becoming more complacent. Some will understand if curriculum doesn't change. Some will understand the security aspects of it, maybe because parents and other people talk about it or they see the odd thing. But I would say more of them are coming complacent and don't see the risk and are using it more blindly. And if we don't change curriculum and change and educate them from a young age, we're going to be in a worse problem in the future. So yeah, if something doesn't happen, it's going to be super interesting.
Certainly agree with you there. And we're seeing big companies, larger organizations roll out sort of practical experience initiatives that might be in the form of unpaid internships or mentorship schemes as well. But we're also seeing a few solutions on the market that are offering practical experience through virtual simulators, for instance, on your phone, for instance. And what are your thoughts on innovative solutions such as that? Is that something you see value in?
Yeah, I think anything that we can do that, brings different people to the table, whether it's, the younger generation or different people in the industry that aren't security practitioners, first and foremost, I think they all are helpful. The question for me is, if you're bringing this app together, like, who's actually downloading the app? Are they forced to download it? Is it mandated with an organization? Is a child going to download that app more than they're going to download Mario? Why would they focus on that? I think it's always hard to do something that is kind of what I would say like informal education, because there's other things that a child will probably want to do. But yeah, if something's mandated that is a bit more innovative, and as I said before, from an education and awareness standpoint, is a bit more exciting and gamified, then I think people engage with it better. So I have no issues with that at all. I just think it's how we roll it out and how we kind of mandate it in certain situations is going to be key.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. And another tough one for you. Appreciate you sharing your perspective. But should big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, or even Amazon have more influence over national cybersecurity strategies? Or does this concentration of power create too many risks for privacy and security?
I do think there's value in them being involved. And I don't think many people could argue with that. Again, going back to your job description piece before, a number of different government departments have been advertising for jobs for CISOs or very senior security people being paid nothing or very low in comparison to the industry. Good salaries, but in comparison to industry, low. Meaning some of the people that you're going to be attracted into those roles are either going to be not as highly skilled, or they're going to be people, which I'm hoping is going to be more so this, they're so focused on improving the industry, improving the sector, and working for government to be part of that, that they're highly skilled and they're in those roles. If it is more of the former than the latter, you've got people arguably in senior positions in government that don't have as much experience as others. Meaning, I think there's a benefit to leveraging experience from these big companies where they have massive, massive teams. You're talking, multiple hundreds of employees in each security team with many years of experience and different perspectives, understanding the challenges that they're facing, which again, some of these government bodies may not. You'd like to think the NCSCs and the GCHQs of the world do. Again, they should also be involved. But I think there's always a benefit from involving these. But obviously, it would more be from a advisory capacity rather than anything else. Obviously, if they were the ones that were mandating it, it could go horribly wrong. But I think there's a huge, huge benefit from it because of the vast experience and scope and size of their teams. They just have a very unique perspective. So yes, there is a benefit.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And are there any other unconventional challenges to the norm or viewpoints that you'd like to share?
Anything unconventional? No one's ever asked me that. I don't think so. I don't have any, there's always some people that are massively controversial, and I've heard different things in the past. So I don't have any massively controversial viewpoints. I do think there are things that people need to focus on, like we said, the basic cyber hygiene and some of those things. And I do think, it's not necessarily controversial, but it's not spoken about often. But I think the curriculum for education needs to change. I think certifications in themselves need to change. Again, not massively controversial. And other things, they've just brought out the chartership, or I think there's like a chartership, a fellowship, an associate, something that have come out to kind of certify people in the industry. It's a nice step, but again, I just think it's the wrong focus. Let's change the CISSP. Let's change some of these other fundamental courses that are more broadly known. These other courses aren't educating people correctly. They're more there to rub a stamp or put a stamp of approval on someone who's already been in the industry for a number of years. And you're saying, you are good at this. Here's a badge to show some others that you are good at this. Whereas we need to find a way to educate people better, to bring them up into the industry, rather than that, in my opinion. I think that doesn't help the industry. It's a bit like going on Checker Trade. It's good to find someone with a badge to say, yeah, you've got the badge. Okay, great. But it's not necessarily improving the industry longer term. We're not bringing a new generation in. We're not educating people differently. And I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in that process. And it's not going to be easy, because you're looking at people like the EC Council, ISC Squared, ISACA, which are all different organizations. So it's different things for us to consider. And I don't know who would necessarily be responsible for that. Is that the UK Cybersecurity Council? Is it GCHQ, NCSC that need to get around it? It's a good question. Not controversial, but I think it's something that we definitely need to look at.
Appreciate you sharing perspective.
And looking at the role of cybersecurity consultant, it's a broad term. I think just to ask the question, really, what exactly would you class as a cybersecurity consultant? And what are the key skills that are necessary for this role, in today's market? And I suppose leading on from that, could briefly give us a few key challenges you faced as a security consultant when you've been advising organizations on their security posture?
Yeah, good question. Again, I think going back to the point of the job description comment that Warren was making before and that we discussed briefly, I think a security consultant can be many things. We work in organizations that are, or I have worked in organizations that are very big consultancy practices or have big consultancy practices. You can obviously have the offensive capabilities that do maybe the red teaming, pen testing, phishing simulation, source code scanning, which is considered more on the technical side. You can also have organizations that do everything from, or consultants within an organization that do things like architecture reviews, do kind of cloud security assessments. Again, they have a slightly different skill set, maybe more DevSecOps focused. You also have what we typically call like analysts or SOC managers that are more focused on the blue team element. So again, they have a very different capability. And then you may have the normal kind of GRC standard stuff that, go from focusing on risk and compliance, looking at standards, methodologies, strategies, etc. So each of those are going to have very different profiles in terms of what they should focus on, which is from a mentorship and a guidance perspective and an education standpoint, very different certifications, very different things to focus on, and arguably also a different mindset. A SOC analyst, you'd want them to be more inquisitive and more kind of analytical, methodical, whereas somebody who's more on the GRC side, I would argue, should be more, not necessarily extroverted, but more confident in talking. They need to be able to speak to senior stakeholders across the business that aren't security mindset and have a security mindset, and to be able to talk about technical terms in a more business manner and interpret that into a business risk. So again, a very different perspective. But I think in all of them, there is some commonalities of being able to articulate clearly. Even if you're articulating from a technical perspective to another technical stakeholder, you need to be able to articulate clearly. I think you need to be somewhat extrovert. And what I mean by that is not even extrovert. It's just basically not completely introvert. If you want to continually succeed and progress in a consulting role, you need to be able to have the right conversations, be willing to challenge, be willing to learn, be willing to, essentially challenge and take some risks. Whereas I think if you're completely introverted, you stick to yourself, you don't network, I think it becomes a lot harder. Networking is super important, as I mentioned before, from a kind of career mentoring perspective, but also it's just really good to engage with others, ask questions, see what they're doing, understand how they could do it better. And also I think as a consultant, given that you are working with a number of different companies, ideally, don't get me wrong, some companies that do consulting will pigeonhole you into one organization for a long period of time, which also has a benefit. Don't get me wrong. Just in my opinion, try not to do that forever. You get a perspective from different markets and different areas. So for example, as you mentioned at the beginning, I've worked in a number of different sectors. I think you mentioned maybe 5 or 6. I've probably worked in much more, probably 20 plus. I don't think you mentioned healthcare as an example. I've done healthcare, there's loads. And I like that because I've seen different perspectives. I've understood how different organizations, different sectors with different regulation understand security and risk and how it impacts them. That gives me a different perspective when I go into a business, and I can talk about it, which gives me some gravitas in a room and gives me some respect automatically, but also shows that I have a different perspective. I know what I'm talking about, and I've not just known my one industry. So there's a benefit there. So I think people need to be eager to learn, eager to experience different things and jump on experiences. I was offered a role working for a global international financial infrastructure firm. And that opportunity meant that I was flying abroad for near enough 2.5 years. I said yes to it because I said, this could be a great experience for me. And I learned loads, absolutely loads. I was willing to go out of my comfort zone and do something that maybe if I was in an in-house 9-to-5 role wouldn't happen. I had to travel on the weekends. I had to lose my evenings. I was, abroad on my own for a substantial amount of time. But by taking that leap of faith and risking it in a consulting world, which gives you those experiences, I learned a lot more than somebody who was doing the 9-to-5, potentially based in London all the time. So I think people can take a lot from consulting, but they need to be able to step out of their comfort zone and do that.
Yeah, and I think just sort of looking at your background, and as you said, we touched on it earlier, you've worked with a lot of the big four, in terms of leading practices in this area. You've helped SME and enterprises across the UK. You've developed those adversary programs. We hear the phrase offensive mindset. Can you explain what an offensive security consultant, does a little bit more for those of our audience? Again, we wanted to give it, some basics on this episode for a lot of people who may not be aware. How does a defensive role differ from, defensive or compliance-based roles in terms of, again, that mindset? You've talked about extrovert, but elaborate a bit more if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, so I think, if we're talking about the GRC side, they're looking more at kind of a preventative, protective mindset. They're looking at implementing controls to stop something happening more so. Whereas a offensive consultant predominantly, again, it's not completely clear cut, but predominantly their main focus is identifying vulnerabilities that are in a system and looking to exploit them to understand the impact. So as an example, they'll be going on a web application that a client has asked us to test. If we're doing a pen test or a vulnerability assessment, whatever you want to call it, and depending on the depth you've been asked to go into, you'll be testing it, understanding what weaknesses are there, what vulnerabilities, what misconfigurations are there, and exploiting them and trying to break them. So the analogy I always give is when I was a kid, I can't even what it was called now. I think it's called a Zen. It was like the rubbish knockoff to an iPod. I think maybe even before the iPod was born. But it was called like a Zen or something like that. Microsoft Zen, I think it was. The minute it stopped working, I undid it. I tried to plug everything into it. I took the thing apart. I even had another one. I can't remember what that was called either. And whenever anything breaks, I take it apart. I want to see what it looks like inside. I want to understand how it works. I want to understand what potentially could be played around with. It's the type of people that would jailbreak an iPhone, understanding how I can manipulate this device and do something with it that I shouldn't be able to do. And that is a mindset of someone who is trying to do something bad, but with a ethical stance to it. So if you haven't got someone who's looking to explore that, looking to expose those things, and is more defensive, they're not going to have the same either analytical, logical mindset to go in and look for those different things and think, what could someone do if they were in this position? If I'm logging into Amazon.co.uk as a standard user, how do I potentially pivot onto a different user? Can I get onto a marketplace user and do something I shouldn't be able to do? Can I check out, for example, we've had the situation before where one of our consultants has gone onto an e-commerce platform, a bit like, the Amazons of the world, and were able to add products to a basket at a negative value. So they added 2 products to a basket. One was 500 quid, one was negative 500 quid, and they could check out successfully in a valid transaction. Again, they were able to think about, how do I put a number of different, in this case, specifically low or informational findings from a kind of scan, an automated scan. How can I put those together to do something seriously malicious that a scan would never pick up? Again, you have to have a very different mindset to be able to do that. And that's why I think the individuals, in my opinion, if you get a good one, are very unique, because being able to do that and not take it in a negative way and an unethical way, and to do it to benefit and improve the industry is huge. Because, I've spoken to colleagues before, and the ones that are very good, they do get contacted by different organizations a lot to be like, can you help us with this? Can you help with it? And a lot of the time it's unethical. And, they are the type of people that have to step away and say, like, absolutely not. That's not what I do. But they've always got the capabilities to do it. So it's a slightly different mindset to the kind of GRC consultant.
For sure. And one last question on this, I suppose, in terms of conducting those offensive, sort of an effective offensive activities, how do you ensure that the findings actually lead to actionable improvements within the client's infrastructure?
Yes, there's different ways about it. Obviously, whenever you do a pen test or some technical assessment, even if you're doing a cloud security assessment, whatever it may be, in most consultancies, you're always providing a customer with, what have we found? What's the finding? What's the implication to your business? What's the impact to your business? What's the evidence? What was the steps in which you took to achieve this? And then essentially a recommendation or guidance of how to improve that, whether it's changing code, whether it's changing some of the, patching something that we've found that's not been patched correctly or hasn't been patched. So there's always the guidance behind that. So organizations, ideally, it's not our responsibility more often than not to actually do that. We provide the guidance to an organization and they do it themselves. But there are more tools that are ensuring that instead of just receiving, for example, a PDF report, that people are actually doing something with it. So for example, if someone was to engage with us, we can provide them that PDF report as well as a kind of visual dashboard through a platform that we have. That platform can also directly integrate with the likes of Jira, ServiceNow to create a ticket in a ticketing system similar to those, to then enable those to be tracked accordingly and make sure that they are fixed. And then once they're fixed, it triggers an alert back to us to say, you can now retest this to make sure that the vulnerability that was identified has now been closed down. So there are things organizations can do with the guidance that is provided, assuming it's detailed. Again, not every organization probably does it in the same level of depth, but the guidance is provided. The onerous is then, or the responsibility is then on the organization to actually implement that fix. But I would recommend people obviously do that as soon as possible, but then also retest it to make sure it's been done correctly. Because as examples, we've seen organizations that say, oh, we've got MFA, we're fine, but it's been incorrectly deployed or misconfigured in some way. And we've been able to subvert it very, very easily and very quickly. So by having something in there doesn't necessarily mean it's completely fixed. Let's make sure we retest it after.
Absolutely. And look, finishing off the episode, and I guess one of the things we'd be keen to understand is maybe if you could share with our audience some more on Bitdefender, your purpose, mission and vision, and what the future holds for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, Bitdefender as a whole, at a very high level, is around 2,500 people globally, about 1,200 people in the lab. So big focus on the labs element, research and development. We do loads in that space. We help a lot of kind of law enforcement agencies across the world, Interpol, Europol, FBI, and NSA, etc. So big focus on the industry as a whole. In terms of kind of what we do, the company's split in two sections, really. The services side that I'm responsible for, which do the offensive and the advisory services, everything from pen testing, red teaming, security consultancy on risk compliance, maturity, event preparedness, everything from that. But then also there's the product side that do EDR technology, XDR, so endpoint detection, so the agents on your device that are essentially identifying malicious behavior and basically closing it down before that. XDR, which is what we call extended detection and response. So that looks at kind of network sensors, mobile sensors, etc. Again, to extend that, we're seeing people obviously now use mobile phones to do more work than maybe their laptops. So why have we not got sensors on our laptops, on our mobiles and our iPads? So again, we offer things like that. Then we have the MDR, which is the managed detection and response, which is the wraparound to help you manage that. If you don't have the capabilities in-house, what do? You can rely on us to do that for you. So there's that aspect, which is really important. But then there's a few other areas. So we have a CSPM Plus tool, which looks at cloud misconfigurations or weaknesses. But I think the thing that I want to focus on the most, all of that, if you want to know more, please go on our website or reach out. But the thing that I think is the most important thing, and is going to be the focus of us this year that we've recently launched, is a product called Phaser. And I believe off the top of my head, it's the proactive hardening attack surface reduction tool. And essentially what it does is, as I said before, albeit again briefly, we're seeing a lot of threat actors now logging into people's devices and living off the LAN. So using native features like PowerShell, for example, that are not always seen as malicious, but are very much used by malicious actors when they need to. They're things that for some organizations, you may close it down, but you wouldn't be able to close it down for everyone. But also how individuals use it is key to that. So what this technology does is it understands how an individual user uses their device independently. And what I mean by that is if I use my laptop differently to how I use my iPhone or my mobile, it understands the interactions and what I do and what functionalities and services I utilize differently. And it actually closes it down. So instead of saying, as an EDR, XDR technology does, let's wait for something to happen, let's detect it and respond to it and basically cut it short so it doesn't have an impact on the business. Let's reduce the attack surface altogether so that someone can't get a foothold into my device before even that happens. So we're reducing what they can do. So say, for example, a threat actor was to log onto a device where someone has been seen to never use PowerShell, and therefore the technology Phaser would basically shut the use of PowerShell down or shut the use of PowerShell for a number of malicious type commands that can be used with PowerShell. The idea is that now if a malicious actor was to go onto that device, they then couldn't use PowerShell because it's disabled for that user. So you're thwarting an attack and reducing the risk of an attack happening and the impact it could have to a business. And it would independently configure individuals' devices differently, which again is extremely annoying for an attacker because, as my pen testing and red teaming would tell you, when we log onto a device, you assume for most organizations there's a group policy and every device is configured relatively the same. Obviously, people would have different levels of access and they'll have different technologies on the devices, but you assume most actions can be taken across the organization, which using our technology won't happen. It's extremely innovative. There is no one that does it. It doesn't conflict with anything out there already. It doesn't. If someone was to do like normal kind of device hardening, you're looking at, again, group policies across the entire organization. This is per device, per user. So it's extremely novel. And there's been a lot of excitement from different organizations and analysts that we've been working with and talking to. So yeah, big push for it this year. So super excited to see how it goes. But it's going to be extremely annoying if our clients start getting it because our red team are going to be slightly less successful.
Exciting times ahead for sure. Well, Nick, thank you so much. It's been really good to discuss and strip down some of the basics. We often get into some of the deep technical side of things, but I think this episode has been particularly compelling because we've really, offered a chance to sort of go back into, some of the more essentials within cyber awareness. And of course, we appreciate you fielding some of Warren's rather challenging questions within the sector. So thank you. Obviously, huge thank you to yourself, our community, all our listeners. I'm sure there'll be, as always, a lot of value to be found in today's episode. People who want to continue the discussion for more sustained engagement, we invite you to join the Secure Cyber Connect community, where, as always, we offer a range of collaborative solutions for our tech and security professionals at no cost. This is such as expansive community access, mutual mentoring programs, online networking, and a range of exclusive interviews, panel discussions, and masterclasses coming later this year. If people want to know more, if they want to gain access to the community and any of our initiatives, as always, please visit secure-recruitment.com/cyber-connect/. Thank you very much, everybody.